In this session, we're going to talk about mainland conquest of the Western Hemisphere. But before I really talk about that, I wanted to tell you a story about a man named Montezuma II. Montezuma II was the emperor of a very powerful and large and major empire, Native American empire in this hemisphere called the Aztecs. They lived in Central America, what is today Mexico. And Montezuma had been concerned for a while just about some things that had been happening in his empire that troubled him. The first thing was they had seen a comet streak across the sky. And in those days, comets were a sign of evil, a bad omen. And actually, for centuries, people believed that. If you saw a comet, that meant something bad was going to happen. So seeing the comet had worried Montezuma and some of his immediate officers and other leaders. Then, all of a sudden, the temple of God in their capital city burst into flames suddenly and burned to the ground. Then the lake in the capital city rose up, boiled over, and flooded a lot of homes and major buildings. A fisherman brought in this very strange bird to show Montezuma and the court. And on this, the forehead of this bird, so the stories have gone, said that there was a mirror there. And when Montezuma looked into the mirror on this bird's forehead, he had a vision. And he saw men, or what appeared to be men, maybe creatures, fighting one another on a great plain. And they were riding creatures that looked to be like a deer, but he'd never seen anything quite like that before. And he asked the elders of the empire, what does this vision mean? And they told him that it foretold the end of his empire. So Montezuma was concerned, and rightly so, because that was about to happen to him and to the Aztecs. Now, in Central America and South America, you had numerous Native American tribes. You had major civilizations, the Maya being the oldest, and then you had the Aztec, you had the Inca. These were powerful, particularly the Aztec and the Inca, and they controlled a great deal of territory. The Aztecs were a warlike people. They had dominated and subjugated a lot of the smaller tribes around them. They also practiced in their religion. It was ritualistic to sacrifice people, and they often sacrificed some of the people from those subjugated tribes. So the tribes living around the Aztec Empire were anxious for anybody to come along who could help them throw off the control of the Aztecs. The Aztecs weren't terribly popular for obvious reasons. So this was kind of the situation. At the time, the Spanish have come over. They have, quote unquote, discovered the Western Hemisphere. They've had contacts with native peoples on the islands. They've established some early colonies, Hispaniola being the first. They had seen examples of gold among those tribes and had learned enough from those tribes, had pieced together some of the words in their languages to realize that they had traded for those gold pieces from tribes in the interior. And of course, the Spanish are interested in trying to find the source of that gold. And so now they are ready to actually move into the interior. So we come to a Spanish nobleman, a man named Hernan Cortez. And this drawing of him appears in your textbook on page 24. Hernan Cortez was a younger son of a noble family, but in those days, if you weren't the eldest son, according to law, you would not inherit. So even if you belonged to a noble family, if you weren't the first son, you knew you were going to have to make your own way in the world. Once this hemisphere is discovered, this is going to be a place where a lot of young noblemen come to see if they can make their fortune, make a name for themselves, and have adventure. Cortez is going to be one of those young men. He comes to Santiago, Cuba, and establishes himself there and does quite well. In fact, the governor comes to him in 1518 and asks if he would be willing to lead an expedition into the interior. He will provide a couple of ships and some of the supplies if Cortez can raise the men. And Cortez is appointed Captain General, and he agrees to take this on. By February of 1519, Cortez had 300 men and ships, and now the governor is beginning to fear that he's losing control. And his concern was that if Cortez went into the interior, had a lot of success, found gold, that he would get all of the glory for this expedition. It would be forgotten that the governor had had the original idea. And so he decides that he's going to take this expedition away from Cortez, writes up the orders for that, and gives them to a messenger to take to where Cortez was in Santiago. Well, Cortez had a spy in the governor's court who learns about what's going on, gets the word relayed to Cortez's brother-in-law, who basically waylays or stops the messenger on the trail, murders the messenger, takes the orders, and hurries to Cortez to tell him that he's got to get out of town pretty quickly, or the governor is going to arrive and take control. And so out of a scene that you would have in a movie, you have Cortez seizing all of the meat supplies in the city, getting on small boats to be rowed out to the bigger ships, and as he's doing that, the governor is riding into the city to try to stop him, but he's too late. And so off Cortez and his 300 men go on this expedition. Now, they sail down the coast, and they get to the Yucatan, and there they're going to have luck. They're going to find a man who had been a captive, but who can speak the language. They can communicate with him because he's Spanish. He knows the Mayan tongue, and then they discover a woman who can speak both Mayan and Aztec. So Cortez is going to have a kind of a good piece of luck there, in that he's going to actually be able to really communicate with the Aztecs when they get there. They also bring horses with them. This is something that native peoples did not have in this hemisphere, so this is going to be something very new, and of course this is going to kind of fulfill that prophecy, that vision that Montezuma saw when he sees them come in on those horses. Montezuma also is concerned or thinking that possibly once word comes that these people are coming, that Cortez could be the returning god, the feathered serpent called Quetzalcoatl. And so if he was a god, they didn't want to upset him or make him angry. So Montezuma is going to make the decision to welcome Cortez and his Spanish troops into the capital city of the Aztecs, just to kind of see who they are and what they might want, and just kind of be very cautious about them. And so they're going to allow them to come into the city. The Spanish received gifts of gold and silver from the Aztecs and began to demand more. It's not too long before the Aztec people realize that these are not gods, that these are just men, and they feel like Montezuma has betrayed them, that he has shown weakness, and so they're going to turn on him and rebel. And in the course of this rebellion, Montezuma is going to be killed, some say by his own people, some say by the Spanish. But in any case, they rebel, they drive the Spanish out of the city, and then the Spanish are going to have to regroup. Now, there had been an arrest party that had come after Cortez, but he and his men had defeated them, and the survivors of that arrest party had joined him. So he'd had some more troops than what he had originally started out with. And then if you'll recall, I told you about the subjugated peoples of the Aztecs not being happy to be under the control of the Aztecs. So they're going to be willing to help the Spanish to regroup, come back in, and retake the city and take control, which is what is going to happen. So by 1521, Cortez has taken the city and has basically established himself as the emperor. For the next 10 years, lieutenants of his are going to go down the coast and into the interior of South America, and they're going to take control of other tribes. Francisco Pizarro is going to be one of his lieutenants who will go and conquer the Inca. They are going to be located in Peru, and this is going to happen in 1531. And by this point, so much territory and so many people have been taken over by the Spanish, they have to figure out a way to provide leadership and government for them. And so they're going to establish a thing called the encomienda system. A Spanish officer or conquistador would be put in charge of a village or a group of villages. He would provide protection for that village, would support a clergy. It was very important to the Spanish to convert the natives to Catholicism, but then he could, in turn, turn around and charge taxes and labor from the tribes. The tribes were put to work in gold and silver mines, and in many ways this becomes a form of slavery for these tribesmen. Spain is going to become quite wealthy with the gold and silver that it shipped back, and this is going to drive many of the other European nations to want to come over to see if they can get a part of this wealth, and that maybe the wealth could be in other areas of the Western Hemisphere. Spanish officers will make their way into North America, and in the notes that I gave you, I listed several of those and their expeditions. Then they're going to be followed by the French and the English. The French are going to come in the 1530s. Jacques Cartier is going to be the primary explorer that will come early, going into the area of what is today Canada. They will refer to it as New France. It will be Samuel de Champlain after 1600 who will actually really get settlement going there, and he is going to become known as the father of New France. Happens after 1600. You'd had a series of religious civil wars in France, and that kind of kept them from being able to be involved in exploration until after 1600. And in this next little segment, I'll talk to you about the English coming over.